March 5th, 1531. The sky was black, but not because of night. Clouds hung low like smoke trapped in heaven. London Bridge slept under frost, its arches cloaked in silence. Beneath the eastern gate, in a quiet square where hangings once drew crowds, like sermons, a fire pit waited like a wound still closed. Suspended above it, the iron belly of a cauldron rocked gently in the morning breeze, its chains creaking like the breath of a dying man. Torches had already been lit, but their flames were held low, as though ashamed of what they were about to illuminate. The guards did not speak. The executioners moved like ghosts, no metal clanked, no boots stomped. They had done this too many times, but never like this. The air was thick with dampness and dread. A sour smell clung to the bricks. Old. Tallow, wet ash, and the faint memory of blood. Somewhere within the tower, behind doors swollen with rot and secrets, a man was being dragged, feet scraping, wrists bound, mouth silent. He no longer pleaded. His voice had been spent days ago. This was not justice. This was an offering, and the city would wake soon. It would rise from sleep to a scream that would stain history like smoke on parchment. The cauldron had not yet boiled, but already the death had begun. The first death was quiet, a bowl of porridge left out for a guest, warm and innocent. By evening, the guest was choking, convulsing, eyes wide as if glimpsing the devil himself. By morning, he was dead and not alone. Others who touched the pot soon followed, gurgling, writhing. Their mouths foamed with unseen betrayal. The kitchen, once filled with salted meats and steaming bread, became a tomb. No one moved. No one dared clean. Word traveled faster than the rot. Poison, they whispered. A deliberate hand. A message hidden in the marrow. The cook was named Richard Roose. He had served the household of Bishop John Fisher, a man loyal to the Pope, suspicious of the crown, and already marked. Roose was not a nobleman, not a soldier, not a politician. He was the man who stirred the pot. He claimed ignorance. A prank gone wrong, a confusion of ingredients. A cook's careless hand, not a traitor's blade. But England was no longer a land of mercy. King Henry VIII, his throne cracking beneath the weight of papal defiance and marital rage, did not see a cook. He saw a symbol. And symbols, when defiant, must be burned out with fire. Roose's hands were bound in front of nobles who would not touch a servant's skin. He was paraded through the courts not as a man but as a shadow, a shape of fear, a whisper that the king's food was no longer safe, that even the lowest could strike from below. This was no longer about porridge, it was about power. And the first drop of poison had not landed in a bowl. It had landed on the crown. He had no allies, no trial, no defense. Only a name, and even that began to slip from the tongues of those who once knew him. Richard Roose became something else. The cook, the poisoner, the shadow at the king's table. In the halls of Parliament, his humanity was stripped like skin. The trial never came because the law had no script for this. There was no clause for accidental kingslaying by stew, so they wrote one, just for him. A bill was introduced not to judge him but to create the crime that would justify what had already been decided. Parliament passed it with speed that stank of fear. Poisoning would no longer be murder. It would be treason. And treason would not be hung or beheaded or even drawn. It would be boiled. No priest came to his cell. No parchment recorded his side. The kitchens he once worked in were scrubbed clean, as if he had never been. The bishop disavowed him. His neighbors whispered his name only in the corners of rooms. Rose slept with rats now. The stone beneath him was slick with mold. His wrists bled from rusted cuffs, and through the slit of his window, he could hear the workers hammering at dawn, building the platform where his flesh would scream. He had become the law's reflection, a man shaped by fear, then shattered by it. And though his face had not yet touched the water, the country had already begun to scald. The ink was still drying when they sentenced him to boil. It was called Lex de Veneno, the law of poison, written in haste, baptized in fear. The words were few, but their weight was immense. Anyone who poisons shall be boiled alive in water or oil without benefit of clergy. It was a rupture. The first time in centuries that the law created a death solely for one man. Rose was not being punished. He was being transformed into a message. The court did not gather. No robes of justice, no Latin verdicts. Just the king's signature and the seal of Parliament, pressed like a brand upon his fate. It was said Henry VIII signed it with a trembling hand, not out of mercy, but fury. This was not merely about death. It was about pain, prolonged and seen. Boiling, they said, was the only death slow enough to match the offense, and so the city was warned. Guards nailed posters to the wooden doors of taverns and churches. Execution by boiling. The words were new, foreign, disturbing. Mothers shielded their sons from reading them. Elders muttered that even the Plantagenets never stooped to this, but the king did not flinch. Within the tower, the cauldron was forged. Chains were tested. The pit was lined with stones to catch the dripping fat, and firewood was stacked not for warmth, but for war. In the streets, silence replaced debate. If a cook could be boiled, what of a printer? A priest? A widow? Who said too much? The law did not just punish. It changed the air. And when Roose was told, he did not scream. He only stared. For the first time, even he began to believe the myth they had made of him. Not a cook, not a man. A lesson. One they intended to scald into the memory of England. There was no bell that morning. Not the usual clang from St. Thomas's, not the market clangor. The city held its breath. Fog rolled low along the Thames, swallowing sound. And from every alley they came. Peasants, bakers, merchants, even children clutching their mothers' sleeves. Not to pray, to watch. A wooden scaffold had been built beside Smithfield's gallows, but there was no rope. Instead, at its center, a monstrous iron cauldron stood, suspended like a thread above the fire pit. Its surface was already sweating moisture, waiting. Torches lined the square. Soldiers stood at rigid attention, eyes straight ahead, hands pale around their spears. No music played, no clergy walked, not even a final blessing. Then came the man, dragged, not walked, limp, bound, trembling, but not crying. His feet left faint smears of blood along the boards. His eyes scanned the sky as if searching for a god who no longer answered. Some in the crowd looked away. Others stared with a hunger they did not understand. The fire was lit, crackling at first, then roaring. The iron swelled with heat. Chains groaned. The surface of the water inside began to twitch. One soldier vomited behind his shield. Roose was lifted by rope and pulley, inch by inch. He did not fight. That had left him long ago. His body shook only once when the first wisp of steam touched his skin. Then the silence broke, not with screams, not yet, but with the terrible hush of something ancient returning. Pain, raw and unfiltered, delivered not for justice but for spectacle. London had seen heads roll, it had seen traitors drawn, but never this. This was not death, this was a performance. They lowered him slowly, feet first. Steam curled like spirits around his ankles. Skin blistered instantly, peeling like wax. The first scream was short, guttural, animal, almost unreal. Then came the others. They clawed their way out of his chest, ripping through smoke and sky. Witnesses would later say it lasted 15 minutes, that he was raised and lowered again to prolong the agony, that his eyes melted open, that skin sloughed from his bones and floated on the water like meat in broth. Children were pulled from the square, sobbing. Others stood frozen, mouths open, too young to understand what justice meant. A woman fainted. A man tried to run but slipped on the wet boards. The stench, burnt hair, open flesh, old fat, hung over the air like incense in reverse. Even the guards began to look away. But the king's law had no eyes, no ears, only flame. This was not a clean death. It was not a quick one. It was a ritual. Each bubble of skin, each crack of bone, a syllable in a language of terror. His cries echoed, off the stone like prophecy, not of forgiveness, not of guilt, but of what power does when fear becomes its prayer. And when the body stopped moving, they did not stop the boiling. The water kept raging, long after breath had ceased, to make sure, to prove that the man was gone. When it ended, no, one cheered. They had come for justice, some said, others for curiosity. None left whole. The crowd dispersed like ash in wind. No one looked at each other. No one spoke. Only the sound of feet on frozen mud and the creaking of the chains as the cauldron cooled echoed in the air. Rose's body was never buried. No, grave marked his name. The remains were poured down the sewers like refuse, but his screams remained. They lived in the stones, in the silence between sentences, in the sudden hush that fell whenever the word poison was uttered in a kitchen. In the way hands trembled before tasting wine, the king did not address it. He moved on, as kings do. But the people could not. For in Roose's death something shifted. Justice had always been feared, but now it was believed. It could not be reasoned with. It had heat, and it had teeth. And if the king could boil a cook for a bowl of porridge, who among them was safe? This was no longer about one man, it was about all of them. They said it was about poison, about safety, but it was never that. It was about control. The king's court was unraveling. Whispers bloomed in corners. Rome still held the keys to England's soul. Anne Boleyn was rising, and with her, enemies sharpened their knives. Henry needed a symbol, not just of death, but of his absolute will. Rose had been convenient, a man of no consequence, a name no one would mourn, a face that could be reshaped into whatever the crown needed. His death was not an execution. It was a ritual of state. Anne Boleyn watched from a window that day, some said. Cromwell recorded every moment. The boiling was not an ending. It was a rehearsal for a future where law bent to one man's fear, for a kingdom where even silence would burn. They erased him. No monument, no trial, not even a record in the royal ledger. Richard Roose was meant to vanish, to be boiled from the memory of England, but horror remembers what history forgets. For generations, parents would whisper his fate into the ears of disobedient children. His name returned in sermons. His death became a ghost, not to mourn, but to fear. He became the parable of what happened when power no longer answered to God, when justice became a stage and mercy a myth. The law that killed him was used once, never again. Even kings flinched at what they had made, and so Roose lived on, not in ink, not in stone, but in shame. Theirs. Henry VIII died years later, bloated, rotting, unable to walk. His courtiers gagged at the smell, his wives gone, his kingdom bleeding. No one boiled again, not because the law had changed, but because the law had scared itself. In trying to erase a servant, the king had carved horror into his own crown. Rose was forgotten by name, but remembered in fire. His death was not martyrdom. It was not noble, it was inhuman. But it made the king flinch. It made Parliament hesitate. And in that hesitation, something sacred was broken. They tried to make an example of him. And they succeeded. But not the example they had planned. His pain became a boundary, a final scream that said this far, no further. The water is cool now. The pit is filled. The iron cauldron rusts in a forgotten corner of a museum, labeled with a name that few read. But the lesson survives, because sometimes a man must burn to prove that a nation still feels, and the most terrifying legacy is the one no one dares repeat.